Welcome to today's deep dive. We're stepping into a slightly different format today.
Yeah, a bit more hands-on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you are joining us, you're likely either preparing to lead an IT audit, or maybe you're an operations professional bracing to be audited, or maybe you're just trying to understand the invisible scaffolding that keeps modern digital enterprises from just totally collapsing.
Which is a lot of scaffolding, by the way.
So much of it.
Okay.
Today, we are basically acting as your personal instructors. We're taking a magnifying glass to the foundational text of the profession. That's ISACA's IT audit framework, specifically the 5th edition.
Right, which most people in the industry just call ITF.
Right, ITF. So our mission today is to meticulously unpack Chapter 2. We're looking at General Standard 1001 and the corresponding General Guidelines 2001. And these sections focus entirely on one massive concept.
The audit charter.
The audit charter. Okay, let's unpack this. Because a charter is, well, I think it's often mistaken for just a dry administrative formality.
Oh, constantly. People think it's just a piece of paper you sign and put in a drawer. But in reality, it is the absolute bedrock of an auditor's independence. It's their authority, their accountability. Without it, the whole concept of a reliable IT audit is just a fiction.
It's the document that makes objective oversight actually possible.
Exactly. So we're going to go through the framework's requirements for the charter, literally topic by topic, in the original sequence. We want you to understand not just the rules, but the profound operational reality behind them.
Let's test that premise right away. So the framework opens with this mandate. It says the IT audit and insurance function must be formally defined in an audit charter.
Right. General Standard 1001.
Yeah, and the text insists this document sets out purpose, responsibilities, authority, and accountability. But let me push back on that word formally for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Because, a modern agile tech environment where an enterprise might be deploying code 50 times a day, doesn't a formal board-level document just introduce a ton of bureaucratic friction?
It sounds like it would, yeah.
Right. Like, why can't the chief information security officer and the audit director just operate on a mutual, documented, working understanding? Just a handshake agreement between professionals.
Well, because a working understanding is entirely reliant on goodwill. And goodwill evaporates the exact moment an auditor discovers a critical systemic failure.
Ah, right. When things get real.
Exactly. Think about it. Let's say that failure threatens a multi-million-dollar initiative sponsored by that very same CISO you just mentioned.
They're not going to be feeling very cooperative.
Not at all. If the authority to investigate is merely implied or based on a handshake, the auditee can simply revoke that authority when the questions get uncomfortable.
They just shut you down.
Yeah. They restrict access to the servers, they withhold critical configuration files, they block your interviews with key engineers. The requirement for a formally defined charter elevates the auditor's mandate above interpersonal relationships. It creates an undeniable institutional mandate.
That makes total sense. It's essentially like trying to enforce a zero-trust network architecture without having identity and access management actually configured.
That's a great analogy.
Like, the rules might exist in theory, but you have no structural mechanism to enforce them when someone tries to bypass the system.
Right. The charter is that structural mechanism. The formal definition ensures that when an auditor requests access to a heavily restricted environment, the inevitable question of who are you to ask for this has a definitive, documented answer.
Okay, but that brings up a critical question of leverage. Who actually grants that mandate? Because the framework states that the charter must be agreed upon and formally approved by those charged with governance.
Yes, it specifically cites the board of directors or the audit committee.
Right, but let's look at reality. The director of internal audit usually receives their paycheck, their budget, their headcount approvals from an executive, like the CFO or the CEO.
Operationally, yes.
So if the executives hold the purse strings, how does a signature from the board of directors actually protect the auditor's independence? Your boss is still your boss, right?
Well, this touches on the concept of dual reporting lines. It's really the cornerstone of corporate governance. Administrative reporting.
Meaning the budget, the HR stuff.
Right, the day-to-day administration.
Yeah.
That often rolls up to an executive like the CFO. But functional reporting must go directly to the audit committee or the board.
Functional reporting meaning the actual work of auditing.
Exactly. The framework insists on governance approval for the charter because executives are the ones actively managing the business. If the CEO or the CIO were allowed to approve the audit charter, they would inherently possess the power to rewrite it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I see where this is going. They could strategically scope the auditor out of certain high-risk areas.
Precisely. Let's say the CIO knows the new cloud migration is severely over budget and lacks basic security controls.
A total disaster behind the scenes.
Right. And if they also control the audit charter, they could simply amend the document. They just add a line saying the new cloud environment is out of scope for the year.
Just legally blindfold the auditor.
Exactly. The danger the standard is designed to prevent. By elevating the approval authority to the board of directors, the framework creates a deliberate separation of power. It ensures the audit function isn't subjected to the operational pressures or, frankly, the self-preservation instincts of the people they are actively auditing.
So the board relies on the auditor to provide an unvarnished truth about enterprise risk. And the charter is the board's mechanism for guaranteeing the auditor actually has the unassailable right to go find that truth.
You nailed it.
Okay, let's unpack this from the perspective of the people actually building and maintaining the technology. So the board approves the charter in some closed-door meeting.
High up in the ivory tower, yeah.
Right. But the standard mandates that this charter must be explicitly communicated to executive and senior management and says relevant elements must be shared with the groups being audited, usually at entrance meetings or through engagement letters.
Yes, 1001.3 communication of the audit charter.
If the board has already granted the supreme authority, why is the auditor required to continually justify their existence at the start of every single engagement? Isn't that just incredibly redundant?
It might seem legally redundant, but it is vital operationally because a network administrator or a database architect doesn't sit in those board meetings.
Fair point.
If an auditor suddenly appears out of nowhere and demands access to encrypted customer databases, that administrator's immediate correct instinct should be to refuse access.
Because they're doing their job. They're protecting the data.
Exactly. The communication requirement translates the board's mandate into operational reality on the ground.
So the engagement letter acts as the bridge. It prevents that hostile gotcha moment.
It removes the shock value.
I mean, if you are sitting across the table from an auditor tomorrow morning and they ask for your complete firewall configuration history, your initial reaction is going to be defensive.
Naturally.
But if the engagement letter provided to you explicitly quotes the board-approved charter and it guarantees their right to those specific configurations, it totally changes the dynamic.
It does. You are no longer debating whether the auditor is allowed to see the data. You are simply discussing the technical logistics of how to securely transfer it to them.
That operational friction is exactly what the communication standard aims to eliminate. It transforms what could be a really adversarial standoff into just a structured business process. Both sides understand the rules of engagement before the audit even kicks off.
Right, and that leads perfectly into the next standard, which recognizes that the business environment isn't static.
Yes, the framework includes a strict requirement for periodic review of the charter. It has to remain aligned with the enterprise's mission. But more importantly, it mandates an immediate review if the enterprise's mission or strategies change, or if the audit function's responsibilities change.
This is crucial.
Let's ground this in reality for the listener. Give me a scenario where failing to immediately update a charter actually breaks an audit function's ability to operate.
Okay, consider a traditional brick-and-mortar financial institution, and they suddenly acquire a native financial technology startup.
So overnight, their whole tech footprint changes.
Drastically.
Yeah.
The enterprise's strategy shifts from managing physical branch infrastructure to managing decentralized applications, cloud-native container orchestration, massive external API integrations.
All modern stuff.
Right. But if the existing audit charter was written 5 years ago, its language might specifically grant the auditor access to quote-unquote corporate data centers and internal network infrastructure.
But in the new reality, the corporate data center doesn't even exist. The infrastructure is rented from a major cloud provider, and the network is entirely virtualized.
Exactly. The old charter is suddenly obsolete. If the auditor tries to evaluate the new fintech acquisition, those newly acquired engineers could legitimately argue that the auditor's charter doesn't grant them the authority to evaluate third-party cloud architectures or external API gateways.
Wow. So they're locked out on a technicality.
Yes. Without an immediate review and update to the charter to reflect that new technological and strategic reality, the audit function is paralyzed. They lose their mandate over the most critical new risks facing the enterprise.
So the charter really has to be a living, breathing document.
It absolutely does.
That perfectly sets up the transition from the high-level mandate of the standard down into the practical blueprints of the guidelines. So we're moving into General Guidelines 2001 now.
Right, moving from the what to the how.
The framework offers an introduction to how these charters should actually be constructed. And it explicitly suggests that if a broader internal audit charter already exists within the organization, the IT audit mandate should be incorporated into it. Merged together, yes. Let's look at the risk there. IT auditing requires highly specialized, deeply technical access. Doesn't burying the IT mandate inside a general financial audit charter risk diluting the specific technical authority those IT auditors really need?
There is a risk if it's done poorly, but the framework recommends integration to prevent a fractured governance structure.
What do you mean by fractured governance?
Well, you don't want the financial auditors operating under one set of foundational rules regarding their independence and reporting, while the IT auditors operate under a completely conflicting set of rules. Integration ensures that enterprise risk is viewed holistically.
Because IT doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly. The systems support the financial ledgers. They support the operational workflows. A unified charter ensures consistent authority across the board while still containing specific clauses that grant the necessary technical access for the IT specialists.
Makes sense. So the framework then outlines the core elements that must be in this document. It breaks them down into 5 buckets.
The 5 pillars of the charter.
Right. We have independence and ethics, purpose and authority, engagement protocols, auditee responsibilities, and finally, the protocols for irregularities and illegal acts.
That last one is a big one.
Yeah, and rather than just listing these as administrative checkboxes, it seems like these 5 elements collectively form a sort of social contract between the auditor and the business.
A social contract is the perfect framing. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the charter isn't just a list of demands empowering the auditor. It binds the auditor to strict ethical standards and engagement protocols,
Ensuring they don't abuse their access.
right, and simultaneously, it explicitly defines management's duty to cooperate, especially in those worst-case scenarios.
Like discovering fraud.
Exactly. If an auditor uncovers evidence of systemic financial fraud embedded in the code of a payment processing application, nobody wants to be arguing about reporting protocols in the middle of a crisis.
You don't want to be figuring out who to call while the building is on fire.
Precisely. The charter defines exactly who is notified, when they are notified, and how, long before the crisis ever occurs.
Okay, let's dig deeper into the actual purpose defined in the charter. That's section 2001.2.3. The framework states the goal is to provide independent, objective assurance by evaluating and testing controls.
The core mission.
Yeah, and it requires defining the scope, whether the audit covers the entire global enterprise or just specific subsidiaries. I imagine scope definition is where massive turf wars happen in multinational corporations.
Oh, scope boundaries are fiercely contested. Because if a global enterprise has a federated IT model...
Let's define federated for the listener.
Sure. Meaning, for example, the European division runs its own autonomous IT infrastructure completely separate from the North American division. If you have that, the charter must clearly define the jurisdictional lines.
Otherwise, it's chaos.
It is. Without clear scope definitions, you risk redundant audits where both the global internal audit team and the regional audit team demand the exact same evidence from an already exhausted IT department.
And there are legal issues too, right?
Massive legal issues. Varying international data privacy laws might legally prohibit an auditor in the U.S. from accessing certain systems hosted in Germany. The charter scope must navigate those legal and geographical realities up front.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. The framework also requires the charter to explicitly list the types of work performed.
Yes, the specific flavors of audits.
Right. It lists the standard categories. Information systems, audits, compliance, financial, operational. But it also explicitly names specialized audits. It provides examples like third-party service, fraud, forensic, and AI ethics.
AI ethics.
Yes. The inclusion of AI ethics really caught my attention. Is naming AI ethics in a foundational framework just a nod to current industry buzzwords? Or does it represent a fundamental shift in what an IT auditor is actually authorized to do today?
It represents a massive fundamental expansion of the profession's mandate. Traditionally, IT auditors evaluated deterministic systems.
Deterministic meaning predictable.
Right. If a password policy is set to require 12 characters, the system either enforces it or it doesn't. It's binary. You can test it easily. AI and machine learning models, however, are probabilistic.
They learn and adapt over time.
Exactly, they change. If an enterprise deploys an algorithmic model to determine creditworthiness for loan applications, the risk isn't just whether the system has high uptime.
The risk is the outcome.
Yes. The risk is whether the model has developed a hidden demographic bias that violates fair lending laws.
Wow. So by formalizing AI ethics as a specific authorized audit type within the charter, the board is basically empowering the auditor to look way beyond basic security configurations.
Far beyond it.
They can actually interrogate the moral and legal outcomes of the enterprise's technology.
Yes. 10 years ago, if an IT auditor started questioning the ethical implications of a software deployment, management would have likely told them to stay in their lane.
Stick to checking the firewall rules.
Exactly. Go check the logs. But the updated framework recognizes that in the modern enterprise, algorithmic bias is a severe material risk. The charter grants the auditor the explicit authority to demand transparency into how those models are trained, tested, and governed.
But having the authority to look at a system is entirely different from having the responsibility to maintain objectivity while doing it. Which brings us to the next section. Let's move to how the framework addresses responsibility. That's 2001.2.4.
Right. Responsibility of the audit and assurance function.
It demands that auditor independence be assessed at least annually. It requires formal conflict of interest attestations from the auditors. Let's play at a subtle conflict here, something that happens all the time.
Okay, lay it out.
Suppose an auditor is assigned to review the access controls of a critical system. But 3 years ago, before joining the audit department, that same person was a systems administrator who actually helped configure those exact access controls.
Oh, a classic scenario.
Right. They don't have a financial stake in it, but they are essentially auditing their own past work. How does the charter handle that?
The charter requires a formal protocol for reporting impairments to independence. The scenario you described is known as a familiarity threat and a self-review threat.
Because they already think they know it's secure.
Exactly. Human psychology dictates that it is incredibly difficult to objectively dismantle and criticize a system you built yourself. You will naturally assume the controls are adequate because you designed them to be adequate.
You're not going to look as hard for the flaws.
Right. The charter mandates that this historical relationship be declared. And the established protocol would require removing that specific auditor from that specific engagement to protect the integrity of the assurance process.
That makes perfect sense. Now, the framework also outlines responsibilities regarding external audit firms. It says the internal IT audit function is required to meet with external auditors to coordinate work, minimize duplication, and share work papers.
Yes, Area 2 of the responsibility section.
From the outside, you might assume internal and external auditors are completely separate entities, maybe even adversarial. Why does the framework make coordination a formal responsibility?
It comes down to enterprise fatigue and operational disruption. Think about the IT operations team that's just trying to keep the business running day to day.
They're already stressed out.
Highly stressed. So imagine the internal IT audit team spends a month heavily interrogating the enterprise resource planning system.
The ERP. The system that handles all the financials, supply chain, everything.
Right. The internal auditors demand gigabytes of transaction log and access reviews. They take up hours of the admin's time. Then 2 weeks later, the external financial auditors arrive for their statutory audit.
And they ask for the exact same logs.
The exact same logs, the exact same access reviews. The business will rightfully revolt. The disruption is immense and completely unnecessary.
So the charter basically forces the internal audit function to act as a shield for the business. They have to coordinate schedules and share their evidence so the external firm can rely on the internal work rather than starting entirely from scratch.
Exactly. It makes efficient resource utilization a formal responsibility of the audit director. You have to respect the business's time.
And speaking of respecting time, the framework doesn't just place burdens on the auditor. It outlines expectations for the auditee, including service level agreements.
The SLAs.
Now, normally when I hear SLA, it dictates how fast an IT service desk must resolve a broken laptop ticket. But here, the charter dictates SLAs for the audit process itself, like how quickly the auditor must deliver the draft report after fieldwork concludes. Does management really have the power to hold the auditor to a strict timeline?
They do, and they should. The framework frames the audit as an internal service provided to the enterprise. Think about it. If the auditor conducts fieldwork and uncovers critical vulnerabilities, but then takes 6 months to finalize the written report due to internal bureaucratic delays.
That's 6 months where the business is totally exposed.
Exactly. They have failed the enterprise. During those 6 months, the vulnerabilities remain open. The SLAs defined in the charter hold the audit function accountable for timely, actionable communication. Management expects and deserves a predictable process.
So what does this all mean? Responsibility really is a two-way street here.
Completely.
The auditor owes the auditee professionalism and clear SLAs, while the auditee owes the auditor their time and assistance. Which brings us to Area 4, auditee requirements. The Charter says management must be available and assist the audit function.
It's non-negotiable.
Let's look at the reality of passive resistance, though. An IT director doesn't want to explicitly deny an auditor access because, well, that looks highly suspicious.
It's a huge red flag.
Right. So instead, they just say, hey, we're in the middle of a massive code freeze. My team is working 80-hour weeks. We will get you those logs next quarter. How does the Charter overcome the too busy defense?
That's a great point, because passive resistance is often way more damaging than outright denial. It burns the audit budget while producing absolutely no results. The clock just ticks.
And the risk remains.
Right. The Charter neutralizes this by formally defining cooperation as a management responsibility. When the board signs the Charter, they are stating that supporting the audit is a core part of management's job description. It is not an extracurricular activity they can just push off.
So the auditor actually has a big stick to wave here.
They do. If an IT director continually stonewalls, the auditor can escalate the issue directly to executive management, pointing directly to the Charter as evidence that the auditee is in clear violation of board directives.
That brings us directly to the hard power of the framework. Authority. Section 2001.2.5.
Right.
Without authority, an auditor is really just a person asking polite questions. This section grants the actual power.
The teeth of the document.
The standard grants the audit function authorized access to all resources necessary for an engagement. It breaks this right of access into 4 pillars: information, systems, personnel, and locations.
Right.
Let's test the limits of these pillars. Starting with personnel, does the Charter give an auditor the right to demand an interview with a third-party contractor who isn't even a direct employee of the enterprise?
Yes, absolutely. Provided the contractor is managing or accessing enterprise systems.
Yes, so much is outsourced now.
Exactly. Modern IT environments are heavily outsourced. If the enterprise relies on a managed service provider to monitor their network security, the auditor cannot evaluate network risk without speaking to those external analysts.
Makes sense.
The Charter's grant of access to personnel extends to anyone operating within the enterprise's control environment. If a contractor refuses to speak with internal audit, the enterprise has a fundamental flaw in its vendor contracts.
What about the information and systems pillars? Let's say I'm auditing a major hospital network. The Charter grants me access to all databases.
Okay.
But the database in question contains highly sensitive, unredacted patient medical records. If I demand administrative access to evaluate the database architecture, the privacy officer is going to immediately block me, citing healthcare privacy laws. Does the Charter's absolute authority override legal compliance?
No, it doesn't. And the framework explicitly addresses this under the heading Limitations of Authority. The Charter must define where the auditor's access legally stops.
So the absolute authority isn't actually absolute.
Correct. In your hospital scenario, the auditor needs to evaluate the security controls of the database, but they do not need to read the actual patient diagnoses to do so.
Right, they just need to see how the box is locked, not what's inside the box.
Exactly. They can review the configurations, the encryption key management, the access logs. If a specific law like HIPAA in the US or GDPR in Europe restricts viewing the raw data, the Charter must explicitly acknowledge those legal boundaries.
Another limitation might be national security, right?
Oh, definitely.
Like, if an enterprise is a defense contractor, the internal audit charter doesn't magically grant a junior auditor without a government security clearance the right to access classified weapons schematic.
No, that would be a disaster and highly illegal.
So the charter protects the auditor by clearly defining what is out of bounds, preventing them from making illegal demands in the first place.
Exactly. The authority is immense, but it is always bounded by law and regulation.
The final piece of authority relates to the processes to be audited. The charter grants the function the freedom to determine what it will audit based on a risk-based plan. They dictate the targets, not management.
This is a huge point of friction.
I bet. Let's play out the boardroom dynamic. The audit director presents their annual plan, and they intend to audit a massive, highly visible digital transformation project sponsored by the CEO.
A pet project.
Right. The CEO pushes back hard and says, that project is too fragile right now. I don't want you in there. I want you to go audit the legacy mainframe systems instead. How does the charter protect the auditor's right to say no to the CEO?
If the charter is properly drafted and approved by the board, the CEO does not have the authority to dictate the audit plan,
Even though they run the company.
even though they run the company. The risk-based planning clause ensures the auditor directs their resources toward the areas of highest objective risk, regardless of political sensitivities. The digital transformation project likely represents a far greater risk to the enterprise's future than the stable legacy mainframe.
Because it's new, it's untested, and it's expensive.
Right. The charter provides the shield that allows the auditor to stand firm and insists that the high-risk project remains on the schedule. It protects the integrity of the risk assessment.
But with that level of unrestricted access and the power to defy executive management, the potential for abuse is massive. Which leads us to the final major section of the framework, accountability.
Section 2001.2.6.
Right. Who watches the watchers? The framework establishes that the IT audit function is accountable directly to those charged with governance. They have to report on management's progress in fixing vulnerabilities, but they also have to report their own performance metrics.
Did they stay on budget? Did they complete the plan?
Exactly. But more interestingly, the framework mandates a quality assurance process where the audit function must survey their customers, the auditees.
Well, a QA process.
Let me challenge the logic of surveying the auditee here. The auditor's job is often to tell management that their systems are insecure and their processes are totally broken. No one enjoys hearing that.
Nobody.
If you ask a student to grade the teacher who just gave them a failing mark, the feedback will be overwhelmingly negative. Doesn't surveying the auditee just incentivize the auditor to soften their findings to get better survey scores?
It is a really delicate balance, but the surveys are not designed to evaluate the severity of the findings. They are designed to evaluate the professionalism of the process.
Okay, distinguish those for me.
Sure, an auditee can fiercely disagree with the finding that their firewall is misconfigured. They might be angry about it, but they should still be able to acknowledge on a survey that the auditor communicated clearly, respected the agreed-upon SLAs, and demonstrated technical competence. If the board constantly sees survey results indicating the IT auditors are technically uninformed, highly disruptive to daily operations, and generally arrogant, that is a massive failure of accountability. The audit function must deliver its difficult messages with absolute professionalism. The QA process ensures they are held to that standard.
That distinction between the message and the delivery makes a lot of sense. So let's look at one of the most complex areas of accountability in the modern IT landscape: service restrictions and non-audit services.
This is a tricky area.
Very tricky. The framework acknowledges that auditors sometimes act as consultants. Let's use an example we touched on earlier. A business is deploying a massive, complex ERP system. The internal IT auditors are arguably the foremost experts on access controls and segregation of duties within the enterprise.
They know the rules better than anyone.
Right. So management asks the auditors to sit in on the design meetings and consult on how to build the security controls correctly from day one. It sounds super proactive, like help us build it securely so we don't fail the audit later. Why does the framework view this as a massive risk?
Because it completely obliterates objective assurance. When an auditor sits in a design meeting and recommends a specific configuration for a CI/CD pipeline or a database encryption method, they cross the line from independent observer to active management participant.
They've effectively made a management decision.
Exactly. They own a piece of that design now.
And when that new system goes live and it's time for the annual security audit, you cannot grade your own homework.
You really can't. If the auditor who recommended the security design is then assigned to audit it, they will suffer from intense confirmation bias. They will inherently trust the design because they created it.
They'll blind themselves to the flaws.
Furthermore, if a breach happens due to a flaw in that design, the auditor has a vested interest in covering up the flaw to protect their own professional reputation. It is an insurmountable conflict of interest.
So how does the charter solve this without entirely depriving the enterprise of the auditor's expertise during the design phase? It seems like a waste to just lock the experts in a closet until the system is built.
It would be a waste. The charter solves it by establishing strict service restrictions and mandating a cooling-off period.
How does that work in practice?
The rules might dictate that if Auditor A participates in a consulting capacity to help design the new ERP system, Auditor A is strictly prohibited from participating in any independent assurance audits of that specific system for a defined period.
Like a year or two.
Typically 1 to 2 years after the system goes live. When it is time to audit the system, Auditor B, who had zero involvement in the design, must lead the engagement.
So it compartmentalizes the function. The enterprise still gets the proactive advice, but the accountability framework ensures the ultimate assurance remains totally objective.
Exactly.
The Charter also demands that auditee communication protocols are strictly defined, detailing how, when, and where auditors will communicate. It really seems like every single element of this accountability section is carefully designed to ensure that the massive authority granted in the previous section is never wielded arbitrarily.
This raises an important point. Authority without accountability is tyranny, even in a corporate setting. The Charter creates a balanced ecosystem. The board demands truth. The Charter gives the auditor the power to find the truth, but it surrounds that power with strict ethical and procedural boundaries.
To ensure the process itself doesn't damage the enterprise they're trying to protect.
Precisely. It's a very elegant balance when it's drafted correctly.
Let's summarize the journey we've taken through the framework today. We started at the absolute foundational mandate in General Standard 1001, the requirement that an audit function cannot exist on implied authority or handshakes.
Right, it has to be codified.
It must be formally defined and crucially approved by governance to ensure true independence from executive pressure. We explored how communicating that charter prevents those operational standoffs on the ground.
The engagement letters.
Yeah, and why the speed of technological change like migrating to the cloud demands the charter be continuously reviewed.
Otherwise, it becomes obsolete overnight.
From there, we transitioned into the practical implementation in Guideline 2001. We broke down the 5 core pillars of the charter, framing them as a social contract between the auditor and the business.
Setting the rules of the game.
We looked at purpose, highlighting the evolution of the profession to include specialized high-stakes areas like AI ethics. We examined the two-way street of responsibility, where auditors must maintain independence and coordinate with external peers, while management is absolutely required to actively cooperate rather than passively resist.
The SLA for the auditors, and the cooperation mandate for management.
Exactly. We then explored the hard power of authority, the 4 pillars of access to information, systems, personnel, and locations, and how that power is bounded only by strict legal limitations, like IPEA or GDPR.
The teeth of the Charter.
And finally, we closed the loop with accountability, detailing how QA surveys and strict cooling-off periods for consulting work ensure the audit function remains objective, professional, and trustworthy. We've essentially mapped the constitutional anatomy of digital trust today.
It really is the Constitution. It's the framework that allows an organization to confidently state to its investors, regulators, and customers that its digital infrastructure is secure, compliant, and ethically governed. The Charter is what makes that assurance possible.
If you are an IT professional listening to this, the next time you are asked to provide extensive documentation, or the next time an auditor pushes back against a management limitation, you now understand the mechanics driving that interaction. You know the rules of the engagement, and you understand the profound mandate that the auditor is operating under.
It's not just an arbitrary interrogation.
Exactly. It is a highly structured, board-directed process. But before we conclude our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a final thought regarding the future of this framework.
Okay.
We spent considerable time analyzing the Charter's guarantee of the right of access to systems, data, personnel, and locations. The entire premise of the IT audit framework assumes that if the board grants the authority, the auditor can physically or logically reach the evidence.
That is the foundational assumption, yes.
But consider the trajectory of modern architecture. We're moving rapidly toward massive, completely opaque third-party cloud environments and highly proprietary artificial intelligence models provided as external services.
Software as a service, AI as a service.
Right. So what happens when your enterprise's board-approved audit charter confidently grants your internal auditors the absolute right of access to all systems?
But the vendor hosting your core business logic legally refuses to let you see inside their black box.
Exactly. If the vendor's legal team points to their terms of service, which prohibit reverse engineering or deep architectural audits of their proprietary cloud infrastructure, your board's internal mandate suddenly hits a concrete wall.
A very thick legal wall.
As technology continues to abstract away our direct physical control over our own data processing, how will the traditional audit charter survive? When the location you need to access is a server farm you don't own, running proprietary code you aren't legally allowed to evaluate, how do you maintain the mandate of digital trust?
Resolving that tension is going to be the defining challenge for the future of IT assurance. The charter may grant the theoretical right, but the architecture of the modern internet often denies the practical reality. The profession will have to pioneer entirely new methodologies for relying on third-party attestations and continuous control monitoring to bridge that massive gap.
It fundamentally challenges what it means to actually verify. And that is something to keep you thinking long after this discussion ends. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the bedrock of the IT audit world. Keep questioning the systems you rely on, keep looking for the underlying rules governing those systems, and above all, keep learning. Until next time.